Hi, everyone. I'm so looking forward to this. We're going to get started in like 2 or 3 minutes. If you're just joining, please put in the chat room where you are calling in from, where you're joining from. I am in Western Mass, where it's been a super hot day, but I'm kind of hoping that it pours later on because we could really use that break in the heat. Really looking forward to this session. Love talking about psychology. Some of you might already know that I love talking about psychology. But I will give it, I know some people are hopping off from a prior session, so I want to be respectful of that before we get started. Oh, and thank you. Some people I saw me moments ago. So thanks for joining. This is a different topic, but also a really important topic. So thank you. And again, we're going to get started in just a minute. I'm going to wait until like what is like 4:32 my time, because I know some people are hopping on from one session to the next. And I'm just going to type in the chat room if you're just joining us. This is my website, where if anyone has a question, you can reach out anytime. And there's a little and this is also, I think they're all being recorded. My understanding is that they're all being recorded, and so you can watch it again through the miracle of technology in that way. So again, just gonna give it one more minute, and then we will get started. If you are just joining us, please put a note in the chat room as to where you are joining us from. And there we go. Now you already know the answer. Where are the replays? That feels like super above my pay grade. So thank you for joining, and we will again get started in just a minute. Wow, Puerto Vallarta. I wish I was there. All right, so it is 4:32 my time. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining today. So my name is Catherine Sanderson. I'm a professor of psychology at Amherst College, and I'm going to be talking now about the psychology of courage and inaction. I know some people who are joining now probably joined me from my earlier session on the science of happiness, which would be a really different topic than the one that we're going to be talking about now. But I think the commonality for me of both of these topics is that what I really like is taking empirical research in psychology and translating it into ways that can have real and practical implications in people's lives. So I want to start now with a story that happened about 6 or 7 years ago. In fact, this month, my husband and I dropped off our oldest child at college for the first time. We went to Walmart and bought a mini fridge and rug, and we, hung posters around his bed, his dorm room, hugged him goodbye, and drove home. And we didn't hear much from Andrew for the first couple weeks of college. Occasionally he would text and say something like, "How do you do laundry?" or "Can I have some more money?" But we really didn't hear much from him. And then about 2 weeks after we dropped him off, my phone rang one night, and it was Andrew, and his voice was breaking, and he said, "Mom, someone died in my dorm last night." And he told me the story, and the story is one that, even if you don't know the particulars of this kid and the school, it's just heartbreakingly familiar. A student had been drinking. He fell and hit his head, late one night, and his friends and roommate watched over him for hours. They checked to make sure he was still breathing. They strapped a backpack around his shoulders to stop him from rolling onto his back and vomiting and then choking to death. So they watched over him because they wanted him to be okay. But what they didn't do for nearly 19 hours was call 911. And when they finally did call, it was too late. A student was rushed to the hospital, where they tried to save him, but it was too late. And so I'm starting with that story because it really illustrates the prompt for what led me to actually start writing and talking about this topic. And that is the psychology of inaction. These were, I assume, good kids who cared about their friend and wanted him to be okay. And yet what they didn't do for nearly 19 hours was call 911. And when I heard that story, I was just heartbroken. This is a kid who was 19 years old who died in his first 2 weeks of college. And as a mom of three and as a college professor who, talks to many people, I was just heartbroken, with how easily that situation could have been avoided. And that's actually what led to what I'm going to share with you today, which is the topic of my most recent book. So when we think about the psychology of inaction, it's very easy to think about it as, college students, acting, poorly and not really being thoughtful and making bad decisions. But the reality is we know that this happens in all different kinds of walks of life. So about 3 years ago, I got a call from one of my friends, and my friend said, I need to tell you a story about my daughter, Claire. Now, Claire had been adopted from China when she was an infant. And in March of 2020, Claire is on a crowded city bus in Boston going to work. Now, Claire is 22, 23 years old. She's recently graduated from college. So she's on this crowded bus in early March of 2020, right before, the pandemic sort of shut everything down. And a man on the bus stands up, points at Claire and says, "You should go back to China. You and all your fellow Chinese people, are killing Americans. You should go back to China." So the man is on the bus and he's, clearly, kind of deranged. Like no one on the bus actually thinks that Claire single-handedly is bringing coronavirus. But the key thing is that no one on the bus stood up and said anything. No one told that man to shut up. No one went and sat with Claire. No one did anything. So again, lots of people in a situation, lots of people knew that, he was crazy, and yet no one supported Claire and she sat alone. And the final story that I'm going to tell you leading up to it is one that you will also all be familiar with. And that's what happened about a little bit over 3 years ago now, George Floyd's murder in Minneapolis. And when I saw the videos coming out of Minneapolis, what occurred to me as a social psychologist was actually not what Derek Chauvin was doing, kneeling on George Floyd's neck for nearly 9 minutes. What occurred to me was there were 3 other police officers with him who had a moral and ethical and, in fact, legal responsibility to pull Derek Chauvin off of George Floyd's neck. And if they had done so, we wouldn't know who George Floyd was, because George Floyd would be living and working and walking around, Minneapolis now. So I'm starting with these 3 stories because they're all the same. They're all examples of times in which people saw or heard something problematic and failed to step up and do something. And the reality is that happens in all different kinds of walks of life. And what we see time and time again is that the psychology of inaction is driven by the exact same thing. For people who are interested in learning more about this, I'm going to put a link quickly to my publisher's website. This is my most recent book, Why We Act, that examines this issue. I also wrote a piece for Medium, for The Conversation, which was then published in Medium last week, on hazing and trying to understand the psychology of inaction around the hazing that occurred at the Northwestern University football team, but again, occurs in lots of different places. So when I talk about this topic of psychology of inaction, I ask people, have you ever seen or heard something problematic and failed to speak up? And when I ask this in a, crowded room or, anonymously online, about 90% of people say, yeah, I can think about a time in which I did so. And I can absolutely think about times in my own life in which I've done so. So then the question is, what leads to that? Now, I'm going to talk about what leads to that. But before I go on, I want to say that typically when I ask again in a crowded room, are there people who remember seeing or hearing something problematic and not speaking up? About 90% of people say yes. About 10% of people say no, that I always speak up. I'm always the loudmouth. I'm always the whistleblower. I'm also the, whatever. And these people in my book, I actually call moral rebels. And if you want to read my thoughts about this, I actually wrote a piece for The Conversation a couple years ago. If you Google Catherine Sanderson, Moral Rebels, this piece will come up very quickly, in which I talk about these people. I'm not going to focus on these people in the scope of today's talk, but if you have a question about it, just ask me at the end. And you can ask a question in the Q&A or the chat. I'll try to get to both of these, and I'll leave at least 10 minutes, maybe a little bit more, for Q&A. So again, ask any questions you have in the chat or the Q&A. Those are both fine. So when we talk in psychology about what leads to people seeing or hearing something problematic and not speaking up, it's always one of 3 things. One, it's ambiguity. We see or hear something problematic, but we're not really sure what we are hearing or seeing. you hear a comment or a joke and you're like, is that funny? Or is that actually kind of like racist or sexist or homophobic? You see two people, engaging in some kind of banter and you're like, is that flirting or is that like sexual harassment? You see a college student and you think, is that student drunk or actually unconscious and I should do something? So the challenge is that in ambiguous situations, we don't know how to interpret it. So what do? Well, we look to see how other people are responding. But here's the challenge. In many different situations, each individual person is like, ooh, this is really a problem. But when you look to other people, they're acting like it's no big deal because all of us individually don't want to appear stupid or foolish for overreacting, for, calling 911 when the person is just drunk and not unconscious, for, assuming that something's a problem when it's actually not. And so here's the challenge. Privately, each of us individually might be like, ooh, that's kind of problematic or that's offensive or whatever. But we look to other people and everyone else is kind of like playing it cool, then we don't speak up. And so the problem here is that each individual person might be like, this is a problem, but they don't want to feel embarrassed. So they don't do anything. The example that I often give is if you've ever been in a college classroom in which the professor says, do you have any questions? You might have a question. But when you go to raise your hand to ask the question, you look around, nobody else is raising their hands. So all of a sudden, you put your hand down because you don't want to look stupid. Even if individually, other people in the room, maybe all of the other students in the room are like, I have a question, I have lots of questions, but I don't want to look stupid. So the problem is that inaction breeds inaction. When it's an ambiguous situation, we look to other people, but it's basically like no one wants to be the first one to speak up. And that can mean that people who are in need of help don't get help and that problematic behavior doesn't get called out. So that's number one, ambiguity. We don't know what's happening. Two, diffusion of responsibility. And somebody actually noted, I think Ariel in the chat room, giving me vaguely Kitty Genovese vibes. Excellent point, Ariel. You saw where I was going. This famous case that you might remember hearing about in your intro psych class, Kitty Genovese, was widely reported when it happened years ago as an example of the bystander effect. Just to briefly remind you, this was a case as it was described in the press at the time. Spoiler alert, there's kind of some recent evidence looking at archival data and a documentary showing that what was described as happening at the time is not really true. But how it was described at the time was heartless and cruel New Yorkers failed to step up when a young woman is stabbed to death, in a courtyard. And as it was described at the time, lots of people heard her screaming, turned on their lights, tried to figure out what was going on. But then they saw these other lights going on and they were like, okay, well, I must not need to call because these other people have already done so. So another factor that leads in many cases to people not getting help is that they look to what other people are doing and they assume, okay, it's a problem, it's bad, but I don't have to be the one to speak up because I'm in a crowd. And so individually, other people can speak up instead of me. So that's another factor that often can drive inaction, that even if we're in a situation and we see or hear something problematic, we may think, well, it's problematic, but it's not my responsibility. And again, this happens in lots of cases in groups in which individually each person feels less responsible for stepping up. Psychologists call this phenomenon diffusion of responsibility or social loafing, this tendency for people individually to not step up in a group. It's frankly why lots of college students don't like group projects. They don't want to be the sucker who does all the work. It's also why restaurants impose a mandatory tipping fee of 15, 20% or whatever on parties of 5 or 6 or more, because people tend to tip less generously when they're in a group. Because again, each individual person doesn't feel so responsible for the tip because other people could make up what they don't contribute. So the second factor that drives inaction is this diffusion of responsibility. Third factor, and this third factor for many people, I think, is the most common, and this is fear of the consequences. We worry. In some cases, we worry about our personal safety. If I call out that crazy person on a train, maybe that person will attack me or stab me. If I call out, something problematic that's happening, on public transportation, I might actually pay with my life. If I jump into that, burning car or whatever, or pull the child who's fallen through a frozen pond, or somebody who's drowning in an ocean, maybe I will pay with my life. So in some cases, people worry about their personal safety, but that tends to be less common. What people worry about more in terms of fear of consequences are two things. One, professionally. If I call out my colleague or my boss for, a sexist joke or, inappropriate, expense account or whatever, maybe I am not going to be liked. Maybe I'm going to be seen as a tattletale or a whistleblower, and I'm not going to get that promotion. Maybe I'm going to be ostracized by my colleagues. So another factor that often leads people to not speak up is, in fact, they worry about the professional consequences of speaking out and doing so. And then finally, we also worry about the personal consequences, not being liked if we call out bad behavior by a friend, a neighbor, a colleague, a family member, a teammate, a fraternity brother. So people also worry about being ostracized by people in their social circle. And fascinating research in neuroscience now shows that being rejected at a personal level, so facing ostracism or exclusion from a social group, actually activates a part of the brain that is the exact same part of the brain that is activated when you feel physical pain, when you step on a tack or get a paper cut or twist your ankle. So what that tells us at an evolutionary level is that physical pain and social pain feel the same at a neurological level. And that means that we are highly motivated to avoid those experiences. And therefore, what do? Well, we fail to speak out in the face of different kinds of problematic behavior because we don't want to experience those negative consequences. All right, I'm now going to turn and I'm just going to spend 2 or 3 minutes talking about what I call the hopeful, uplifting part of this talk. And that is important. And I want to share with you a quote, which really to me is the essence of this talk. And here it is. It's by Martin Luther King Jr. History will have to record that the greatest tragedy of this period of social transition was not the strident clamor of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people. And to me, that quote is really fundamentally important because what I believe is that most of us, and maybe even every single person listening right now, are the good people. That these are people, we are good people. But many of us have at times, for very normal psychological reasons, failed to speak up in the face of problematic behavior. And failing to speak up and act in the face of problematic behavior allows that behavior to continue. And so here's the good news. The good news is that in part, understanding the psychology of inaction helps us overcome those very normal forces and speak up and act. And that's really, really important to remember. So I want to end by shooting through very quickly some strategies you can use to speak up in all different kinds of situations. I also want to say, and I'm actually going to put this in the chat room. I wrote a very quick piece a few years ago that's about 6 tips for speaking up in the face of problematic behavior. And I'm going to put a link to this in the chat room because this, again, is like sort of key takeaways. What are things that you can actually do in the face of problematic behavior? So number one, provide training and practice. Sometimes we've been in a situation where we see or hear something problematic and we don't know what to say or do. And so we do nothing, but we keep percolating on it. And like 2 days later, we're in the shower and we're like, oh, that's what I should have done. That's what I should have said. And so here's the thing. Thinking through a situation, what could you do? What could you say before you're in that situation can be really helpful so that when you're in that situation, you're not sort of stuck with, I don't know what to say or do because you've thought through it in advance. So one, thinking through what you're going to say or do and practicing is really important. It's why people who are CPR trained go through and practice again and again and again so that you know what to do if you're in that situation. People get recertified in CPR every year, every 2 years. So you know what to do if you ever need to call upon those skills. So that's one. Two, foster empathy. Put yourself in somebody else's shoes. I love giving this talk in part because if it was my son lying unconscious in a dorm room, I would want somebody to call 911 immediately. If it was my daughter on public transportation and having somebody yell racist or sexist slurs at her, I would want somebody to go and sit with her and make her feel better. So putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, imagining how would it be to be the person who is being ridiculed or ostracized or, whatever, bullied is really a helpful way in giving us the courage to speak up in different situations. 3, look for ethical leaders. we know that ethical leadership matters. I do a version of this talk all the time for law firms, for hospital boards, for high schools, et cetera. And what we know is that ethical leadership flows from the top. If you have a coach or a captain or a boss who's not acting in an ethical way, that actually trails down. So what we need to do is make sure that we are hiring and promoting people and putting people in leadership positions who are willing to behave with courage, with integrity, because that sort of sets the tone for other members of that group. Ethical leadership flows from the top. Find a friend. For many of us, it actually can be hard to speak up alone. So finding somebody else in your community, in your neighborhood, in your family, in your workplace, in your school, in your sorority, whatever, in your team can be really helpful at giving people the courage to speak up. Sometimes two people working together can actually be more effective at creating change. So find a friend and talk to that person about what you're seeing, feeling, observing, and go with that person to try to talk to the person in charge or to report that kind of behavior. Many of us are more courageous with somebody else. And here's the final thing that I'm going to leave you with. What we know is that all of us working together can change the culture. The piece I wrote most recently for Medium talks about how we can do this in the scope of athletic teams, so that we are changing the culture to focus on creating a culture in which what being a loyal, good friend means is looking out for the whole group, not hiding the bad behavior of one or two people. I think the most important thing that all of us can do is to work to create cultural change in our own groups so that we all can feel proud of what we've done. Time and time again, I give this talk and I hear stories from people who failed to speak up, and often that failure to do so haunts them for days and weeks and months and years and sometimes even decades. I gave this talk at one point and a dad came up to me at the end and said, as a dad, what I want to do is make sure that my kids always speak up, because I can still think about times in which I didn't speak up when I saw bullying, and it still haunts me to this day. My book, Why We Act, again, which is a long version of this talk, it's actually dedicated to my three kids. And the dedication is to Andrew, Robert, and Caroline, with hope that you will never be silent about the things that matter. Again, Martin Luther King quote. So again, thank you all so much for listening. I have given my website address and a couple of links in this chat room. I'm now going to turn to Q&A. Absolutely feel free to ask a question in the Q&A or the chat room. I'll try to get to both. If I don't have time to get to all the questions, it's also fine. Or if you're watching this as a recording, it's totally fine to email me again, or put a comment on my website and I can get to it then. Okay, so I'm going to go through now and answer the questions. And so the first question is, or do people think that they have more to lose than they do? So yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. So I think two things. One, sometimes people really worry about, well, what are the consequences of speaking up? And they have to evaluate that, right? Like, am I going to lose my job? I regularly say to people, listen, if you notice bad behavior from your boss, and if you think reporting it is going to get you fired, find a way to report it anonymously. Find a way to get somebody else to report it, a friend or somebody who's not in such a precarious situation. So I don't think that there's one size fits all. What I think is that we all need a bunch of tools and strategies we can use so we can use that right situation, the right strategy in a given situation. I've also heard from many people, and the research bears this out, that sometimes one person speaking up leads a bunch of other people to follow. So periodically I'll be in a meeting and I'll hear or say something problematic, and I'll speak up and I'll be like, hey, you probably didn't mean it like this, but what you said might be seen as da-da-da. So maybe we want to, change the tone or the language or the words, whatever. And invariably when I do that, other people will say to me, hey, thanks so much. I was thinking the same thing. Or hey, thanks for saying that. I agree, etc. So often it takes one person speaking up to kind of change the mood, change the room, change the direction of a conversation. I believe that if one student in that dorm room that I described at the start of my talk about the student who was, unconscious and dangerously ill, I believe if one student had said, hey, I think we really need to call 911, I bet other people would have been like, yeah, I think you're right. We're really worried. And maybe if somebody had called 911 quickly, that student would be alive today. And that's the kind of reason why it's so important to have one person speak up. Next person has said, I am a tall, blonde-haired Caucasian woman with a well-educated accent and a PhD. I've learned not necessarily to expect being liked. I've noticed that I'm much more ready to speak out than my friends, neighbors, fellow subway riders who may be second-generation immigrants, people of color, et cetera. Perhaps I have much less to lose than they do. Hey, so that's such an important question. And I actually would say two things on this. Number one, I think that you are absolutely right that if you have less to lose, it's imperative to speak up. There are times in which I've spoken up because, like, I have tenure in my job, and people who don't have tenure, maybe are in a more vulnerable situation. And so, yes, I think for people who have the ability to speak up in a given situation because of their title, their position, their affluence, their whatever. It's really important to do so. I also think, and I kind of wondered if this is part of the question, that there are also people who don't worry about being embarrassed or looking foolish. So sometimes people will be like, hey, I'm 65. I've looked foolish before. I'll look foolish again. I don't care. And so there are times in which people also sort of feel like, I'm over it. It doesn't matter to me. When you're a teenager or a young adult, it can feel like looking stupid or feeling embarrassed is like the worst thing that could ever happen. And so I also think for some people, embarrassment isn't such a big inhibitor. I spoke earlier about moral rebels, and what research shows is that moral rebels often, they don't embarrass easily. They're like, yeah, if I look stupid, whatever, I'm not going to die. Like, that's not a big deal. And so I also think that there may be individual differences within us in terms of how inhibited we are about the idea of speaking up and looking foolish or feeling stupid in that way. And that can be an individual difference. Okay, I think I've actually finished the questions that were in the Q&A. I'm now going to turn to the chat. And let's see, I am going through the different answers. Sorry, I'm scanning. And let's see. Oh boy, sorry, I'm going from the beginning. Yeah. So let's see. Number one, power of social psychology is so intense. The ways we take off cues from each other is massive. And that's absolutely right. I mean, just time and time again, that's what the research shows. It's why I love social psychology. And thanks for putting the link, Ariel, to the murder of Kitty Genovese. And again, this is a question from our comment from Ariel about we can walk by somebody on the sidewalk slumped over. There's actually something called the urban overload hypothesis, in which many people who live in cities actually kind of develop blinders because there's so much need and potential emergencies all the time that you simply block them out as a way of sort of functioning. So that's, again, a really important point, that in some cases it can be sort of a survival mechanism to pay attention to some things over others. And yeah, fear of personal safety is real. And so let me be clear here. I don't think the solution is always jump in and call out somebody on public transportation. That's a question I get a lot. There was a wonderful thing that went around on Twitter about a couple months ago about a woman who was being sort of accosted on, I think, a train in Boston. Somebody was yelling sort of sexist slurs at her. And somebody on the train who she didn't know walked over, sat beside her, and was like, oh, hey, are you going to that party? Da, da, da. What do you think about da, da, da? Pretended that they were friends, and then got off the train when that woman who was being attacked got off the train. They were absolute strangers. But what she felt was, having somebody sit with me made me feel better. So it doesn't have to be speaking up and calling out the person who's being offensive. It can be making sure that the person who's being accosted isn't alone. It can be disrupting the situation. So again, what I want to emphasize is that we all have a repertoire of skills. And what you want to do is find a skill that you can use in a given situation that feels comfortable and safe to you in that situation. And yeah, Patricia said, when the internet first came out, I was hopeful that once we knew firsthand about the suffering in the world that we would take action. I think it has actually had the opposite effect: information overload, powerlessness. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And in a sense, there's really interesting research from economics showing that when we hear about one person in need, we feel like, okay, I can do something. When we hear about all the need, it just feels impossible. I'll say on kind of a personal note, I've started doing something actually starting in 2023 in which I foster rescue dogs. So basically, I live in Massachusetts, fostering puppies that come up from like Arkansas, Tennessee, Mississippi, Texas. And I will say it's super rewarding because it makes a tangible difference in this dog's life. The dog has a place to stay for a week or two, kind of getting socialized, a little bit of housebreaking, crate training, and then the dog gets adopted to its forever family. I cry every single time. Every single time I've said goodbye 8 times. 8 dogs in the last 8 months. I always cry, take a picture of the dog and their forever family. But here's the thing. It's making a difference for this dog, and it's making a difference for their forever family. So it's one dog, one family. I'm not helping save all the dogs in the whole world, of which there are thousands, millions, etc. But again, it's a way in which we can all kind of make a tangible difference in a small way. Ethical leadership. Yeah, thank you for that, Ingrid. Yes, the world, the country needs ethical leadership. Totally agree. I'll just leave that there. The whole world. Yes, yes, yes. And thank you for that suggestion, Teresa. And Teresa's example, I was bullied in grade school, and that's when I found my voice. Often people can say, I remember being in the situation, and that experience helped you find your voice, in part because I'm sure it taught you greater empathy, right? And that often makes a giant difference. I know I'm out of time. Sorry. Thank you for these comments that many people are saying. Again, talking about the psychology of inaction is a first step. And Chloe's comment, sometimes when presented with facts, people double down on their entitlement to having any opinion. How do you deal with those people? Here's what I'm going to say. I remember the sort of famous AA slogan, right? God grant me the wisdom to know the things that I can change and the things that I can't change, and the wisdom to know the difference. I'm sure it sounds better than that. But here's the reality. We can only control ourselves, but knowing that you did the right thing, you said did the right thing, even if you don't change other people, at least you know, and there's power and integrity in knowing that you did what you could in that way. And again, thank you so much for the nice comments. And yeah, Elizabeth, I think some of the bystander dilemma is related to compassion. People often forget to give to themselves and others. More compassion, more empathy is so important. Yes. And again, Cheryl has said, thanks so much, Catherine. I've always spoken up for others. Again, you are a moral rebel. That's what I'm going to say. Could not have lived with myself if I didn't. Yeah. And is that covered in Why We Act? Yeah. I'd say chapter 9. And again, Why We Act is available on Audible, Amazon. You can listen to me read aloud on Audible. Independent bookstores, my favorite, et cetera, in that way. And yeah, Ariel, I do think disrupting the situation is important, that we all have choices about what we do. Okay, I know that I'm out of time. Again, I'm going to put my website, sandersonspeaking.com. I can send somebody, you can watch a link to a longer version of this talk on my website. And again, you can also leave me a little note in that way. And also, if anyone's on Instagram, I'm on Instagram at Sanderson Speaking as well, where I talk regularly about, psychology, et cetera. And my most recent piece on Medium is about hazing, and talks about sort of the psychology of inaction in all sorts of different situations. And my work on educating people about the psychology of inaction I've done in college campuses has shown that education can help prevent disordered eating, can help increase students' willingness to get mental health care. And I actually have a new paper coming out, literally just published like last week, that examines how this can be used on college campuses to help address the mental health epidemic. So again, reach out anytime. Follow me on Medium, where I talk about psychology all the time. Thank you so much for listening, and have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Take care, everyone. Bye.